Hello, thank you for attending the FAV Speaker Series. I'm Laura Kelley, Executive Director of the Central Florida Expressway Authority, known locally as CFX. Our agency is a proud partner of the FAV Summit, and this year the FAV Speaker Series. For those of you who are not from the Florida area, you may not know that Central Florida is one of the fastest growing regions in the nation. It is reported that nearly 1,500 new residents move here each week, not to mention the more than 75 million visitors that travel to the Orlando region every year, or at least when there's not a pandemic. And that's why, back in 2014, the Florida State Legislature expanded CFX's mandate to build and maintain a regional transportation network serving all of Central Florida, including Orange, Lake, Seminole, Osceola, and Brevard counties. Today, CFX owns and operates over 125 centerline miles of expressways, and our proposed 5-year work plan will invest over $3.2 billion to accommodate growth and build a future-ready mobility network. And a part of delivering a world-class integrated transportation system is keeping pace with emerging innovations. That means collaboration is needed now more than ever. CFX is proud to partner with industry leaders to advance safe, innovative transportation solutions, such as our partnership with the University of Central Florida develop an award-winning wrong-way driver detection and prevention system, which has now successfully turned around 85% of wrong-way drivers. Or our most recent partnership with advanced sustainability through powered roadway electrification, more commonly known as Aspire, to pilot a new electrification technology that will charge all types of electric vehicles while traveling at highway speeds on a portion of CFX Expressway. As automated vehicle technologies continue to advance, we are thankful to have forward-thinking leaders like Senator Brandes, who is advancing policies that are helping to make our state's transportation system one of the most resilient and advanced systems in the nation and the world. As we gather today for our fourth FAV speaker series, we are also honored to join industry thought leaders in the automated vehicle space. Throughout the FAV speaker series, our discussions have highlighted how automated vehicle technologies have begun to outpace the regulatory framework. And as this discussion continues, I'm so excited to introduce Marc Scribner, Senior Transportation Policy Analyst at the Reason Foundation, and Matthew Lipka, Head of Policy at Nuro, as they provide their insights on how and when to modernize regulations for an AV world. Marc and Matthew, we are glad you're here today. Please tell us a little about yourself before you get started.
Well, thank you for that kind introduction, and thank you all for being here today. I am going to begin my brief presentation by defining automation. That's the word of the hour, and then move on to discuss some traditional distinctions between federal, state, and local motor vehicle regulatory responsibilities, and then discuss some recent automated vehicle policy development activities at both the state and federal levels, and then conclude with a few recommendations for both state policymakers and federal policymakers. So with defining automation, the most popular definition that's taken hold in recent years comes from SAE International, what used to be known as the Society of Automotive Engineers, and they define driving automation on a spectrum. And it ranges from level 0, which provides drivers momentary assistance. And an example here is automatic emergency braking. And that goes up to level 5, where the automated driving system is responsible for the entire driving task under all conditions. Today, automation at levels 0 through 2 is available for consumer purchase. If you have a newish vehicle, you probably have a level 1 adaptive cruise control system. And if you've got the latest Tesla autopilot release, you have a level 2 system. But it is at level 4 where things get really interesting. This is where drivers can be relieved of all driving responsibilities and not have to take over when the automated driving system encounters a problem. And importantly, for this discussion today, where manual controls can in principle be eliminated and vehicles radically redesigned for novel purposes. Moving on, the motor vehicle regulatory ecosystem has been divided among federal, state, and local authorities. At the federal level, you have vehicle safety and performance requirements that are administered by the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration and to a lesser extent the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration for heavy trucks and buses. The feds also are involved heavily in infrastructure funding and coordinating activities under the Federal Highway Administration. At the state level, you have authorities dealing with constructing and managing the infrastructure, as nearly all of the road network in the United States is owned by state and local governments. States are also responsible for driver licensing, vehicle registration, traffic operations and enforcement, insurance, and liability determination. At the local level, there's a lot of overlap with some of the state functions, but county and municipal authorities are responsible for constructing and managing their infrastructure, as well as traffic operations and enforcement. In recent years, really since 2011, we've seen quite a bit of activity around automated vehicle policy in the U.S. Since 2011, more than 40 states have considered AV legislation. And since 2011, 30 states have successfully enacted AV legislation, the latest example being HB 2813 in Arizona, which was enacted in March 2021. And that was basically codifying a 2018 executive order dealing with AV testing in the state. This legislation across the country has spawned a variety of regulatory approaches, from comprehensive permitting and reporting requirements that you see in California to less onerous, more insurance-based approaches as we see in Florida today. At the federal level, the approach to date has largely been defined by several non-binding guidance documents and voluntary reporting programs for developers. However, the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration has initiated 7 ADS rulemaking projects in recent years, although all except for one remain at the pre-rule stage. That one, the Occupant Protection and Automated Driving Systems Rule, reached final rule status in January 2021, but was caught up in the transition between administrations and what's called the regulatory freeze, and its future is currently unknown, but we hope to know more about its future soon. This would have been the first automated driving system related final rule published by the federal government, and it would have amended 13 of 25 crashworthiness federal motor vehicle safety standards in an effort to eliminate barriers to self-certification for automated driving system equipped vehicles. One other regulatory activity of note is the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard exemption process. Under this process, manufacturers can obtain temporary exemptions from one or more federal motor vehicle safety standard. Generally speaking, this is limited to 2,500 vehicles per year for a maximum 2-year period, with a potential maximum 2-year renewal. So the practical maximum for producers of automated driving system equipped vehicles today is 10,000 of the same production vehicle over 4 years. I know Matthew will have more to say on this, because to date, only Nuro has been granted an ADS-related Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard exemption for its R2 vehicle, and that occurred in February 2020. So I'll close with recommendations for policymakers. For state policymakers, respecting competencies at various levels of government is going to be critically important going forward. This expertise among the various levels of government has been developed over decades, and there's really no reason to reinvent the wheel. One of the dangers, maybe things that keep me up at night, is the prospect of 50 mini NHTSAs. And that's really something, that safety and performance regulation that's been done by the federal government for decades. That's really something that should stay with them. States should stick to their wheelhouses, as should the feds, as should the locals. States should also audit motor vehicle codes for existing barriers, and I know Matthew will have more to say on this because this is directly relevant to their business. States should also distinguish between vehicle types. There's a lot of potential vehicle types that may not be quite the traditional highway vehicles we've seen in the past, and states should be flexible with regard to these novel types of vehicles and not look to necessarily treat them the same way. States should also remain neutral on future business models. There's a lot of well-meaning efforts out there, and some, unfortunately, seek to define the future based on our limited knowledge today. There was an example of model legislation being developed, and I think they earnestly thought that this would have promoted the development and deployment of these types of technologies. but it left out an important market segment, specifically traditional fleet managers and the rental car industry. And I don't think that was intentional, but that would have been codifying essentially the limits of their imagination today into the future, and that's a real danger. And related to that is preparing for an extended period of uncertainty. We really don't know what the future is going to be like. The timelines are tricky. Getting this right will be hard. But state policymakers should seek to give themselves the most flexibility going forward so they don't run into problems of their own making. And then for federal policymakers, promoting sound regulatory policy development is very important. It's going to take time. Really what they should be doing is sticking to the script they've been following for the last several decades. And that means using expert developed technical standards, which are known at the federal level as voluntary consensus standards, using those to guide future rulemaking activities rather than government regulators attempting to come up with technical standards on their own. And the rationale for this, and it's long been recognized at the federal level by Congress and various administrations, is that much more technical expertise lives outside the government than within it. So while the federal regulators have an important role in this process, they should be sure to partner with experts who may not reside in government. The federal government and Congress specifically should work to provide temporary regulatory relief for automated driving system developers. As I mentioned, we're basically maxing out at 10,000 under current law. That's going to have to be significantly increased if we're not going to have the current regulatory apparatus potentially cut off development, deployment going forward. So there should be a finding of what's known as an equivalent level of safety, but that current 2,500 per year limit should be raised if an equivalent level of safety has been demonstrated. And that exemption process can also feed back into the regulatory, the rulemaking process, which we'll discuss later. And then finally, last but not least, ensuring uniformity in vehicle safety and performance policy by the federal government is very important. Like I said, the prospect of 50 mini NHTSAs across the states keeps me up at night. Perhaps, the only thing that scares me more is the prospect of 10,000 mini NHTSAs spawned from local governments across the country. Those state and local governments, like I said, have a lot of expertise in various areas of motor vehicle regulation, but this is not one of them. That expertise is at the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration, the Federal Motor Carrier Safety Administration, and we should let those folks, those experts, continue work and develop a national safety and performance framework for those vehicles so we don't risk innovation and the benefits of this technology going forward.
Thank you very much, Senator Brandis, for organizing today's session and this conference. Mark, for inviting me to participate as well. Enjoyed your remarks. So what you just saw was R2, Nuro's custom vehicle designed specifically for delivering goods, driving on the roads in 3 different states, fully autonomously, no chase car, no lead car, and really exciting that we were able to do that in 2020. And I think this is the beginning of the services, of some of the services that we're going to start to see actually on the road, which makes it a perfect time for today's discussion about autonomous vehicle regulation. Just briefly to introduce myself and Nuro. So Matthew Lipka, I lead policy for Nuro, and Nuro is a fully autonomous, is building a fully autonomous vehicle, and we're deploying it on the road to deliver goods. And what's a little bit different about Nuro is that our vehicle has no space for human passengers. We have, or driver. We have done this for a number of reasons. It's safer, it has environmental benefits, which we'll get more to in a minute. But what we're doing is actually we're designing this self-driving software that lets the vehicle drive itself. We're building a custom vehicle that we're going to talk a lot about today. And we are owning and operating this vehicle in a commercial service. So Nuro is about 4 years old. We are headquartered in California with operations in Arizona and Texas. And we have deployed our service in partnership with leading retailers. So we partner with Kroger's Grocery, CVS Pharmacy, and others to deliver essential goods to people that live in neighborhoods. We're actually the first in the world to operate a fully autonomous service that was open to the general public in 2018, and we've been continuing to operate it consistently since then. How it works is you order from a retailer, the item you have, say it's your groceries, milk, cheese, eggs, is packed by employees in that store, perhaps newly hired employees, that then load it into the R2, our vehicle that you saw in that video. You get a text that we're at the curb, and then you either enter a PIN code, or now we have a contactless option. You can give it a thumbs up and the doors will open. You grab your stuff, tap done, and the vehicle drives off autonomously. One of the big advantages of this is that it is more affordable than traditional services, because most people can't afford to add $15 onto the cost of every errand, which is what the average grocery delivery costs right now. We currently serve an area of Houston with about 150,000 people in it. And in addition, we previously had our service in Arizona, and we have testing operations in California as well. During the pandemic, our service is clearly at pilot scale at this point, but we were able to deploy it in some ways that were helpful, and I think demonstrate some of the future potential of this technology. We partner with food banks in all 3 regions to deliver food to families in need. We also did mass deliveries, and we partnered with 2 California Office of Emergency Services temporary hospitals to transport linens, foods, and medical supplies from the clean zone into the patient area to reduce the number of people that needed to enter those hospitals. So obviously small scale, but we think suggestive of future help. So I talked a little bit about Nuro and what we're doing. Before we turn to regulation, just briefly, how are some of the social implications of this technology different by focusing on last mile delivery? And I should clarify that the Nuro goes on the road. It's not on the sidewalk. It's a motor vehicle, and it is specifically for goods delivery. So the first case is safety. By redesigning a vehicle, we can build a vehicle that is much safer in terms of, one, taking the number of people on the road and reducing it, right? The safest trip is if you're staying at home while your goods come to you. In addition, we can redesign that vehicle to be narrower, about half the width of a standard car, which gives us more room to maneuver around others. And then we're also able to make it wider because we don't have extra equipment, whether it's leather seats or a stereo system or a brake pedal and steering wheel, that make the vehicle smaller overall and reduce its weight. And finally, we can redesign the front of the vehicle to be protecting those that are outside, because we don't need to design it with hard steel materials that are designed to protect occupants. In addition, this vehicle is battery electric, so it has environmental benefits, and there are significant economic benefits for this delivery use case. I mentioned that some of our partners have hired additional workers at the store to pick and pack groceries and load them into the vehicle. It's not just companies like Nuro that are hiring people to manufacture the vehicle or maintain it or charge it. It's also the partners that are able to grow their business and their delivery business that need to hire people to load the groceries, because previously that was done by me driving to the store myself and loading my own items. Finally, we think there's a huge time benefit, right? We spend a huge amount of time every year driving to and from the store. It's 43% of all vehicle trips are shopping and other errands. And if we can give that time back to people, it's a huge impact. And it's also an impact for people that may live in particular further from the store. If you live in a food desert, for example, which is a low-income community that's more than a mile from a grocery store, getting to those fresh produce and supermarket prices can be more challenging. And so that is, we think, a benefit to make it much more affordable and easier for them to get access. So that's a bit about the technology, the service, and why we're doing this. I'm going to turn now to the subject of today's discussion, regulation. And I'm going to start with on the vehicle side. And why is it important, we think, to modernize vehicle design regulations? Marc did a great job enumerating the issues with the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standards. Right? The federal government regulates vehicle design, and the FMVSS, as they're known, govern that design of the vehicle. Those were written. I think Marc shared with me the median age of those is 1980. Was the kind of median time of writing those. And at that time, a vehicle that could drive itself and never have a person inside of it was science fiction. Updating those standards to allow new kinds of vehicles without having to get an exemption, ideally, in the first instance, but to have regulations that are specifically designed for this kind of vehicle is really important. And the reason for that is that there's many advantages to having new vehicle designs. Right? We talked about some of the safety advantages to having these vehicles. There was actually a recent study out from Virginia Tech, a transportation institute, that looked at per mile how much safer is an occupant in this vehicle compared to the average vehicle on the road, looking at all of the crashes in the last 5 years across the country in the area that these, what they call occupantless vehicles, are likely to operate. And they found that per mile, that the vehicle design itself could reduce fatalities by 58% and injuries by 62% per mile. So that's pretty significant impact that we could have from this technology, and that's on top of the really important safety advantages of the software that never gets drunk or distracted, doesn't speed, and can take more conservative routing choices. So that is a significant benefit on safety. And just put that in comparison. When airbags were mandated in the 1990s, they reduced the fatalities by 11% in the vehicles that they were installed in. Now they've improved and are over 30% reduction in fatalities, which is amazing. But we can also take from that the lesson that this technology will keep improving. This is just R2 for generation 2. Once we're at R10, we can expect even greater benefits. Because these vehicles are zero emission battery electric, that can also have a big impact environmentally, not just on climate change and carbon, but also on local air pollution. People don't realize, but the weight of the vehicle is really important to local air pollution, things like particulate matter. By having a lighter vehicle, that actually reduces the amount of local air pollution from the vehicle, even beyond the benefits of electrification. So there's a lot of environmental benefits to new vehicle designs. And with autonomy, we think they're more likely to be electric, like Nuro's 100% electric vehicle. There's also efficiency benefits. Right? These vehicles, as you may have seen, have 2 compartments, so we can batch trips, and other vehicles are really designed for sharing first, not having a driver that is that is there to in a ride-hail service, for example, opens another seat that you can share with people, and that improves the efficiency and lowers overall VMT. And then convenience. Right? We can have new models that we may not have anticipated in 1980 when these regulations were first developed. That is going to give us all back time that we really need in our daily lives. And if we think about this kind of more broadly, if we lock in traditional vehicle designs, then we're going to get traditional outcomes. We are going to get lots of carbon emissions, lots of pedestrian deaths, which went up by 20% per mile, according to the latest statistics last year, even as people drove less. And we're going to get lots of parking lots and traffic. So if we want to change some of those dynamics, reduce congestion, reduce emissions, and reduce road fatalities, we need to rethink some of these vehicle designs. And we should do it in a way that allows innovation and competition to happen. Right? We're not interested in banning any kind of vehicle. We want to be able to compete with those vehicles on the free market with a level playing field on regulations. And then I want to talk a little bit about some of the implications of new vehicle design for the FMVSS in terms of exemptions and rulemaking. One thing that's really important to note is that the traditional OEM design timelines for a new vehicle are 5 to 7 years. Right? So if you're creating, just updating the Toyota Corolla from 11 to 12, 2011 to 2012, that's faster. But if you're creating a new vehicle platform like Nuro is, the traditional OEM takes 5 to 7 years. And you need to know at the point of designing the vehicle, which is at the beginning of it, before you do the tooling and manufacturing of it, what to design to. So having these rules updated now is really important to get new vehicle designs 5-7 years down the road that can have all these safety benefits. And every year that's delayed is just pushing us out further into the future. We're able to do some things now with exemptions and our current low-speed vehicle, but really getting the full benefits will take updates. And so what does that mean for example, an exemption? Well, Nuro got an exemption for R2, which was a really critical milestone in the industry and really critical for us to be able to deploy R2, which, as I mentioned, is now on the road in 3 states. But if we think, and NHTSA did that in 14 months, which is quite rapid compared to many of the historic ones. So that's a really positive step. But we need to maintain that speed or increase it, because if you need to know at the point of design what you're designing to, you're basically taking a risk by designing a vehicle that requires exemptions. And then in order to get that exemption, there's a lot of interest in getting data about that vehicle. But in order to get that data, you have to build the vehicle. This is a paradox, right? You have to build the vehicle not knowing if you can deploy it in order to get the data to justify the exemption. If you have the vehicle ready to go, you have the data, and then it takes 4 or 5 years to get an exemption, that's going to make this a really long process. Finally, on the rulemaking side, we think the right long-term solution here is to update the rules, right? It doesn't make sense for the rules to require even a vehicle that has no people in it to have airbags or a brake pedal. No one will ever use those features. So updating those rules is really important. And the occupant protection rule that Marc alluded to earlier, if finalized, would address about half of the standards. It would address the ones that address occupant protection, like those airbags, and say, if you have a vehicle that will never have a human inside, you don't need an occupant airbag. You can design that vehicle to protect those that are outside. And that's an important step, but we need all of those rulemakings to move forward to really have that certainty and not have to kind of go through this timing paradox of exemptions. The counterpart to the FMVSS is state vehicle equipment codes. So although the federal government principally designs vehicles, states also have their own vehicle equipment codes that in some cases duplicate the federal, in some cases have separate incremental requirements. In Florida, for example, it's required to have side view mirrors, windshield wipers, and a dashboard indicator that shows when your high beams are on. Those things don't make sense for a vehicle that has no people inside of it. And so some states, and Florida is really leading on this, are updating their regulations. And Senator Brandis with SB 1620 and Representative McFarland with House Bill 1032 are leading this effort to update the regulations to clarify and do that audit that Mark alluded to earlier. And it's really important that states that want to see this technology deployed do that as well. I'll just touch briefly on the software side of things with the ADS rulemaking before opening it up for discussion with Mark. So the ADS stands for the Automated Driving System. That's the software that lets this vehicle drive itself. And NHTSA, the Federal Traffic Highway and Auto Regulator, recently started the process of creating a safety framework to regulate these vehicles and this vehicle software. And Mark pointed to how it can sometimes be risky to regulate too early. And I think just want to elaborate on that by saying that the risk here is you could exclude new techniques and new applications. So just to give you an example, take the camera. So traditionally, NHTSA has done something like, say, your camera has to have a certain resolution. They do that right now on your backup camera. If you do that, you miss out on thinking about overall safety of the vehicle. Right? So the way that the quality of the picture of the camera is not just based on the resolution of it. It's also the software algorithms you have for analyzing it, the quality and power of the computer on board that vehicle. It's also sensor fusion, which combines not just the camera, but other sensors like radar, LiDAR, thermal cameras that are on the vehicle. And if you think about all those things, some of these techniques for fusion and for interpreting camera didn't exist 3 years ago. You're leveraging machine learning in new ways. And so if we are having a standard that says you have to have at least this resolution on the camera, it'll miss all these other sensors and all these other ways that we can improve the technology. And even getting beyond that, there are things like what vehicle you use, right? Nuro's vehicle is narrower and can choose safer routing and more defensive driving. That matters to overall safety, but if we just focus very, very narrowly on just sensing, you miss out on the vehicle choice, on the quality of the planning system. And so we're seeing this technology develop very, very rapidly, and we want to make sure that we enable all of the new techniques that are coming out and don't kind of lock us into a certain technology. You also have the potential for a mileage test we've heard, or a vision test. Some of the challenges for that is that, for a mileage test, that actually incentivizes easy miles, as it's known. So basically driving on a highway. But to see one pedestrian on the highway, you have to drive thousands of miles. To go see one in the neighborhood, you have to drive 2 blocks. And so some of the different applications of this technology, like local last mile delivery, might not need the same number of miles or the same kinds of miles that a highway based trucking solution might need. And so if we focus on some of the solutions like mileage or a vision test, again, what you need to see on the highway, different from what you need to see in the neighborhood, is we might end up locking out certain applications. So in terms of the path forward here, Mark, I think, alluded to this earlier, that there are technical standards under development right now. I think that's really important work, and that's something that the regulators can build on. Actually, the original FMVSS were developed by codifying existing industry standards and then developing them back in the 50s and 60s. It also happened with OSHA, for example. It's a common way that government regulates. And I agree with Mark that the federal government should really lead here, having many different states trying to develop these new standards that when we're kind of really at the cutting edge of this, and we have sort of a small number of vehicles on the road so far, could lead to limiting some of this innovation. That said, there's still a number of things that could be usefully done here, and so I'll close with that. One, the safety framework that NHTSA is developing, they can articulate clear principles for how they're thinking about future regulation and how they will go about this. That's a process that is ongoing, and so making it clear what the roadmap looks like is really important. Secondly, codifying best practices. The last federal government best practices document was published 5 years ago in 2016. The state of the art has really evolved. We think topics like safety culture, safety processes like ISO 26262 or safety cases really need to be highlighted there, as well as the importance of redundancy and continuous improvement. And finally, we think there's a lot of work that could be done in research, defining common definitions, and convening stakeholders to make sure that we are moving forward in the most efficient way. Just to give one example, there are two metrics that are commonly discussed, like disengagements and close calls, but there's no agreed upon definition for that. And if you look at California, where these are required, there's 60 companies testing there, and there's 60 different interpretations of that definition. So getting a common definition that is not subjective and that everyone can agree on will be really, really important. I'm happy to go deeper into that. But let me pause there and stop, as I've been talking for a while, and open it up for discussion. So Marc, you and I talked about a few areas that we wanted to dive deeper on. So let's just start with, first any open reactions, or if not, let's dive right into exemptions and what you think we need to see looking at the future of exemptions.
Well, I say we dive right into exemptions, and that's a really interesting one because Nuro is the only company to have received an ADS specific exemption to date. So, I have a question for you, Matthew, or maybe we can tease out some thoughts. But having, your company having experienced the exemption process and knowing a bit about how NHTSA works, what do you say, how valuable do you see you mentioned the paradox of exemptions, but how valuable do you see the exemption process in potentially informing future rulemaking activities, to the development of future FMVSSs? Because if you're required to furnish this data as part of the exemption process, in principle, that could be a way to get novel information to NHTSA, which traditionally relied heavily on historical crash data in informing its regulatory approach, and obviously that doesn't really work in this case. So, what do you think about the prospects of exemptions, at least in the interim, while we're still trying to get the FMVSS apparatus modernized, the regime modernized, as serving as this kind of conduit of new information to safety regulators?
Yeah, I think it's a really critical role for exemptions. So Nuro's exemption was very, very narrow. It said that we did not have to have side view mirrors, we did not have to have a windshield, and that when we're going forward, we could keep our rear view camera on. There's a rule that requires it to be deactivated to avoid driver distraction. And so all of those are physical attributes of the vehicle. But as a condition of our exemption, NHTSA asked 30 some questions about how the software worked, and we responded to them in our public comments with 50 pages or something of writing, and that's available to anyone. And then we also are now providing on a quarterly basis a data about the mileage we're driving, the disengagements in the software, and so forth, and then having discussions with the regulator about those reporting. And that's really important because, one, it can enable new kinds of vehicles on the road. It can enable new kinds of more vehicles on the road as well. But it also means that there's more quantity of data just produced in the world, but also provides NHTSA with privileged access to that through the exemption terms. And that's data that we were not voluntarily submitting before, but we are working with them now to provide. So I think that's really important for understanding the ADS. In addition, now that we have R2, we are using it to inform future vehicles. So for example, R2 has to have brakes, and it has high caliber brakes, but those brakes, the testing for them is different than if you have a full speed truck, right? Pickup truck, something like that. And as we look to the future, we are using R2 to start practicing some of those tests, developing test procedures, so that for future vehicles that may need to go faster and therefore may need to meet different braking standards, we actually can do those tests now, and we can provide information from that testing that we do on closed courses, of course, to NHTSA to inform how do they rewrite the standard of braking so that they, doesn't assume you have a brake pedal, and doesn't assume you have someone that's physically in the vehicle that can test, for example, what happens if the engine fails? Is it still able to brake? And we have a different kind of way of responding to that than a vehicle that has a human in it, because a human can just push on the brakes with their foot. We don't have that, so we have to have redundant braking systems. And so there's different testing procedures that are needed. And so we can actually inform not just the software side, but also the vehicle side. I did want to kind of highlight one other thing on the exemption front, because you said 10,000 vehicles a few times. You are assuming that NHTSA will grant a renewal in doing that. And so they've not always granted renewals. It's an application process, and there's not yet been a vehicle that has gone through that renewal process to renew an exemption. So it's granted for up to $2,500 a year for 2 years, and there's a possibility of extending it. And the reason that I think that kind of 10,000 versus 2,500 is meaningful distinction is that when you're building a manufacturing line, you need to actually build it to scale. And at $2,500 a year, there is not a scale, you can't build a scalable manufacturing line, right? So R2 is actually built in partnership with Roush, which is a great company. Their claim to fame is building race cars, right? Kind of hand-built vehicles is not the right way to scale this technology into the future. And so one of the things that there's been a lot of discussion about, and I think is necessary, is legislation that gives NHTSA more flexibility on the quantity of vehicles that can be built, so that it's not just limited to a small pilot program of hand-built vehicles, but can actually be manufactured in a scalable way while they work towards rulemaking.
And do you think I guess to put a finer point on that, so, that's a maximum of 10,000 over 4 years for the same production vehicle. But so you talk about and this has been bandied about a lot by even some in the press about the number per year of exempt vehicles. But what about the terms of the exemptions? So right now you have a maximum of 2 years. Do you think that should be increased to say 3 or more years before even hitting a potential renewal? Is that something that could, if you both increase the volume, the annual volume, and the number of years that you can produce under that exemption, is that does the time matter much to you guys in addition to the volume?
Yeah, I do think it's important because if you can build it for more years, then you're going to have a greater time to earn back the very significant upfront investment in developing the vehicle program. And if we want to see more investment in the United States, and with the American Jobs Plan is clearly focused on spurring that, our economy needs that right now. That is something that will help spur more investment. The other angle on timing is a little bit what I was alluding to earlier about the timing paradox. There's no time frame in law about when NHTSA needs to get back to you. In fact, they don't even need to announce to the public that they've received the exemption or put it out for public comment within any kind of defined time frame. In 2016, the Obama-Biden administration committed to doing a total processing time of 6 months for simple exemptions for AVs and 12 months for complex ones. Obviously, 14 months is longer than 6 months, but still, we were able to make that work. But I think that's also a really important timing aspect. And some of the legislation in the AV START Act would put some time frames around that, but some of the proposals would not put a kind of time frame for making the decision on it. So I think both are important, the time frame of how many years, as well as how many how long until you get your answer of whether you can go forward on the vehicle.
Right. I think that's a great point, because reaching that decision point can be, almost as important as, whatever the decision is. You want to know. Yeah, that's great.
Well, let me tee up another topic for us here, because you put a lot of emphasis on this here in terms of what states should not do in terms of avoiding creating 50 NHTSAs. But what do you think states can usefully do, and kind of maybe what's motivating you in pointing out the risks of the 50 NHTSAs, and why does that keep you up at night? So maybe we'll start with that before we get to what's useful.
Well, I just have a strong sense of doom when it comes to regulatory agencies attempting to regulate something that they don't understand, and I think that's the case whether that's the State Department of Transportation or the Department of Motor Vehicles. This is simply outside of their areas of expertise. You've seen in California, which doesn't do nearly all that NHTSA does, but does a bit more than states generally do on automated driving systems, really struggle with the burdens put on them by the legislature there. And I think these were, often those bills were supported by ADS developers at the time. But I think it's you kind of putting regulators out of their depth is I think is dangerous, not necessarily because these are bad faith actors, but because this simply isn't their area of expertise. And we already have, the prospect of having this patchwork. I do think, thankfully we haven't experienced that really yet, but I think it is a real risk the longer you have the federal government not make some key decisions on this. I think states justifiably are wondering where Congress and where NHTSA is on many of these important matters. So at the very least, I would like to see, legislation in Congress address things like reforming the exemption process along the lines of that you suggested, just to provide a signal to the states that, the feds in their traditional motor vehicle regulatory authorities are awake. They're not asleep at the switch. They're paying attention and they're working on this. But also, I think states and it depends where you go and what the context of the conversation is, but there's often been some misunderstanding about the challenges that the federal government has, and I think the biggest challenge right now is that those technical standards, those voluntary consensus standards, as the federal government calls them, that are developed by third-party consensus standards bodies like SAE International or ISO haven't been published yet. So they're not ripe for incorporation. So I think there needs to be better understanding, between the various levels of government of where things are, what the current realistic capabilities of regulators are, and what to expect, at least in the near term, because I think that can solve a lot of these potential headaches if everyone could just kind of get on the same page. Not, necessarily having to, states trying to do what the feds are doing or feds trying to do what the states ought to be doing, but just sort of understand where all of these pieces fit together.
Yeah, I hear you, and I think that in California, Nuro has received the only deployment permit, which allows a commercial service. And the standard in the statute for DMV was the regulator has satisfied itself that the vehicles are safe to operate. That was the direction that they had to work with. And I think that DMV worked through that very, very diligently and responsibly in California in order to make the decision about the deployment permit. But coming up with the right standard with enough specificity for state regulators is a really challenging thing for state legislatures to take on. And it may be, I think it's advisable to, as you say, for NHTSA to do things like putting out its ADS framework, which, by the way, many states commented on and were able to give input on, including California, Maryland, and others. Just coming back to this idea of this being a place where there's not technical standards incorporated yet, the standards that were given by the California legislature being open-ended. Are there other examples that you can think of where this is actually normal, right? Like this technology had its first pilots really in 2018, where as the very first. We still have, according to DOT, only about 1,400 of these vehicles on the road out of the 290 million vehicles on the road. So given kind of where this is it unusual compared to kind of other regulatory processes to not have technical standards yet for a technology of this level of maturity, and from what you've seen, Mark?
No, I don't think so. I mean, we're dealing with, very well, Matthew, as working for a developer, but these are very novel technologies. I mean, I remember 10 years ago at some conferences where, you had some cool prototypes, but nothing approaching the functionality you have in vehicles such as R2 and things like that. And this has all happened really rapidly. Standardization, the kind of technical standardization, generally follows the initial development. But there's also a feedback loop. I mean, once there's a sort of a process that's widely agreed upon as this is the going to be the industry standard. Well, then you sort of codify that as a technical standard, and then eventually the federal government will possibly get around to incorporating that standard into a regulation. But yeah, I mean, I think these are normal time frames, and I understand that there's a sense of urgency among some about various aspects of this, but this is normal. And I'd give an example, another example in the automotive realm, not outside of the automated vehicle realm, but I don't know, how familiar folks are with the adaptive driving beam headlight saga, but that kind of illustrates how these standards, outside standards bodies and federal regulators can interact. So what happened is these adaptive driving beam headlights basically eliminate the distinction between high and low beams. You have individual LED bulbs that automatically adjust to the outside lighting conditions and adjust the beam to minimize glare. So it defeats, it provides better illumination without having to switch between these discrete high and low beams. And these were first deployed about a little over a decade ago in Europe and Japan. But they ran into a problem in the United States because the federal regulation, the Federal Motor Vehicle Safety Standard, the lighting standard, 108, requires that discrete high and low beams. So initially, what the Society of Automotive Engineers, which had written the standard that is incorporated in that regulation, said was, well, we could deal with this through adaptive driving beam could be considered as a type of semi-automatic beam switching, which was permitted under the federal regulations. But then NHTSA took a look at that and said, no, that does not meet our standards. Your standards don't meet our standards. So then SAE went back and drew up a specific ADB headlamp standard and sent it to NHTSA. This whole process is still ongoing. It's taken since I believe it was Toyota initially petitioned NHTSA on this to update the 108, but I think we're on 8 years now, and that's just to have the permission to install a better headlamp. And I don't doubt the sincerity of regulators on this and working to make sure they get this right. But that's sort of the status quo, what we're dealing with. And when we're dealing with a new technology, like with ADS and the surrounding technologies, those timeframes may not cut it in this rapidly innovating, iterative environment. So that's my take on this. I think there needs to be a rethink of potentially of how of how we proceed with these new technologies.
Yeah, the phrase that jumped out at me from the recent document that NHTSA put out about how to regulate the software is that it must be highly performance oriented. I guess as opposed to performance oriented, it must be highly performance oriented. And I think that's right. Like we have to look at the overall safety of the system, which is a new way, right? Having a very specific standard that could prevent new things from new headlamps to something that's more dramatic, like a vehicle that has no people in it at all and can reduce just pure number of people on the road by 50% for every trip it replaces. So I think that we're going to have to see a new system at NHTSA, but I do think your example of the interplay between the standards body and NHTSA does show that that we're not late on creating these standards for this technology. I think electronic stability control was most of the market by the time it was the subject of a standard, which is an important braking standard, but it was before it was the subject of a federal motor vehicle safety standard, and so I think it's pretty normal for the requirement to be for certain levels of equipment to come a little bit later. Just in our last few minutes here, Mark, I want to come back to this question of what can states usefully do. I know there needs to be signals from the government, from the federal government, about that they're working on this. We talked about some of the risks, but do you see things that would be useful for them to do? And I have some. I alluded to Senator Brandis and Representative McFarland's bills, which I think are really important. But what do you think is important for them to be working on?
Well, I think the legislation from Senator Brandis, and your point about how we have these redundant, but sometimes not redundant, sometimes extra requirements in the equipment codes. I think that is probably the most important thing states can do to prepare themselves for this. But I also think that there may be a role for states in defining where the lines of authority within their states, between the state regulators and the county and municipal regulators, who also play a role in motor vehicle regulation, better defining where those lines are. And I think, possibly doing some innovative things. This would be more at the local level, but I think states could absolutely encourage and support locals in this endeavor. But doing things like figuring out how to manage curb space. This has already become an issue with the rise of ride-hailing services and increasing demand for the curb. And as we have more of these vehicles, we're likely going to need to see innovations in curb management. And I know that this is my boss, Adrian Moore, 25 years ago when he was getting his PhD, he was working on curb management issues. So these issues aren't new, but I think there is perhaps some new urgency, and I think with the technology as it's advanced, I think there's some new approaches worth considering, whether that's pricing or some more kind of traditional management, but recognizing that the curb, I think, is going to be really valuable going forward in a way that it's not really understood as such right now.
Yeah, so you kind of stole my favorite one of the curb. I fully agree with you on that. I bike around or drive around, and I'm thinking, how is my son going to pass his driver's test if he has all these double parked cars to maneuver around? I don't remember this from when I was doing the test, and I think that we don't want to design the Nuro bot to be double parking, right? That's not like we're trying to design a vehicle that follows the law. And but if there's no space to pull over, what are we supposed to do? We're supposed to pull over 3 blocks away? That doesn't work for someone who might have a disability or who might have urgency or timing and time sensitivity. So it puts us in this challenging situation if there's no delivery locations of the curb, and we also don't want to plan to double park. And so that's I think definitely an important one. The other one I'd highlight, and I think we're talking more on the local level at this moment with the curb and this comment, is law enforcement interaction. I think it's really important for developers, and Nuro does this, and I encourage other developers to do it as well, to create a law enforcement interaction plan. And so, we did that. Our first version was a 30-page Word document, because it was written by a reformed lawyer, and that didn't work. So we got their feedback, and we came back with slides, pictures, because if someone is trying to use this protocol, they are on the side of the road, they don't have time to read a manual, right? And so making it very intuitive, but ideally you don't want to be reading even that document before when you need to respond to something, whether it's something to do with an electric vehicle, something to do with a autonomous vehicle, or just pulling someone over. And so doing training and sessions is really important with local law enforcement, because if you think about a vehicle like Nuro's, we operate on neighborhood roads, right? Where's the grocery store? It's in your neighborhood. So those roads are typically owned by cities and counties, right? I think it's something like 25% of all roads are city and county roads. Well, most of the neighborhood roads are that. And so most of the law enforcement we interact with or could interact with, we haven't had a large number of issues, but if we, that we could in the future as we scale, is going to be local law enforcement. And so making sure they know, if there's ever a ticket, here's where you put it. You want to check the registration. We have this hidden compartment that we're going to show you, but not tweet about, because we don't want people to steal the registration out of it, because it's an unmanned vehicle. And so I think there's a number of things like that where it's really important to work with local officials. And then, of course, just being engaged with neighborhood groups and city officials is important as well, because they're going to respond to whatever new dynamics come up, right? We didn't know what rideshare would be like 10 years in. So as we evolve these services, we're going to see new issues, and we want to be responsive to the concerns of elected representatives and the people that they represent. So just making sure that open line of communication is open. So I think those are a couple things that add to your great point about the curb.
Yeah, that's great. And I think you guys and some others, given your business model, are in, with respect to law enforcement interaction plans, you're potentially dealing with, all these, very local, municipal, in addition to county law enforcement agencies, whereas some of the automated vehicle developers that are focusing on long haul trucking, that may be, they may be, the problem there with law enforcement interactions may be a bit easier for them, because they're mostly be dealing with state police on freeways. So I think, the lessons learned from this really hyper local experience that you guys are dealing with, I think could help others going forward, and kind of create best practices for educating law enforcement officers, first responders on what to do when they encounter one of these vehicles on the road.
Well, thank you, Mark. This has been a great discussion. Really appreciated you and the organizers for putting this together. And now I'm looking forward to taking questions and invite everyone to submit questions, and we look forward to answering them. We'll be back in just a moment.
The Central Florida Expressway Authority, or CFX, was formed in 2014 to usher in a new era of regional transportation to plan cooperatively, pioneer customer-first solutions, and advance innovative mobility choices that make travel smarter and safer. And here in Central Florida, innovation is part of our DNA. After all, it was Mr. Innovation himself who envisioned a transportation system to connect residents and visitors to attractions, the Space Coast, and commerce throughout the region. And that same vision vision still drives us today. With 125 miles of regional expressway and a $2.7 billion 5-year work plan, CFX is driving regional mobility. And in collaboration with local and national partners, CFX is extremely proud to have piloted and created the first tri-protocol toll transponder, the award-winning wrong-way driving detection and prevention system, the first drive-up customer service reload lanes in the continental U.S., and the first ever short-term toll pass exclusively for rental car customers. And most recently, CFX became one of the first agencies in the Southeast to partner with Aspire to pilot the electrification of expressways to charge electric vehicles at highway speeds. Our customers make this possible. Every toll dollar is reinvested in Central Florida to provide a world-class integrated transportation network. Because at CFX, we believe we are moving so much more than cars. We're moving futures.
We are enjoying a very important and timely discussion on regulations impacting AV innovation. Viewers, if you have questions, click the button at the bottom half of your screen. And Matthew and Mark, we are already getting questions from our viewers, so let's just jump right in. The first question is, are you designing Nuro to communicate with other vehicles? Also, are you designing Nuro to communicate with infrastructure and governmental agencies, such as, receiving info as a governmental agency and then having that governmental agency report hazards?
Hi, Laura.
So Matthew?
Thanks for the question, and to our viewers. So Nuro is actually designing our vehicle to act like other vehicles on the road. So the answer is no, we're not designing it for special kinds of vehicle to infrastructure or vehicle to vehicle communication. Our approach is that we need to take the infrastructure we have in the world as it is and be able to navigate that because we know it's so expensive for just to maintain the infrastructure we've already got that the investments for this new kinds of technologies will take many years. As that comes online, it's certainly something we're looking at is, how can we incorporate this once it's available widely, but it's just not at the point right now where it is it's something we could rely on, and we want to make sure our vehicle can navigate safely based on the infrastructure that we're on the roads of today.
Thank you. The next question we have is, I think, a really good one. Matthew writes, my state has a few metropolitan areas, but it's mostly rural. How do you see the technology rolling out in rural areas? And I think this is a question that both Mark and
you want to go first? Happy to take it also.
Well, yeah, I'll go first, Matthew. And yeah, that is a great question. I'm sure Matthew can give you the kind of Nuro perspective, these kind of the small deliveries. But I think in rural areas, it's probably at least initially going to be quite different than urban areas, just given the population density and what that means for the economics of any kind of transportation service to operate in rural areas. So one thing I think you could see, though, a lot of interest in rural areas is on the passenger side, and specifically paratransit. Paratransit, which counties are already often contracting with private providers, but it's very expensive. And paratransit is for disabled folks, elderly people who can't otherwise drive, don't have access to a vehicle. And it's very costly to offer that service. So one potential for this technology would be to significantly reduce that cost and have greater coverage, more reliability than what you can get today. So that's one application I think.
Yeah, it's
an
interesting example. We actually have in Houston partnered with the local paratransit agency to provide free grocery delivery to paratransit users in our service area. So it's definitely something that I think there's a lot of interest in doing that. So they don't have to take 2 paratransit rides just to go to the grocery store, that they have to schedule 24 to 48 hours in advance. So potentially very convenient delivery instead. I think there's a number of ways it can roll out. So Nuro's vehicle right now is really designed for more urban areas because it's limited to 25 miles an hour, urban and suburban. As we are able to go at faster speeds, as the federal motor vehicle safety standards are updated, we'll be able to serve more rural areas. And actually, I think rural is a really good early use case for the technology, because one of the hardest parts of self-driving is predicting the movements of vulnerable road users, who obviously can be very severely impacted if there ever were a crash. And so there are just less pedestrians on rural roadways, and less objects of all kinds generally. So I think that it's actually a good early use case for this technology. Another area where you might see the economics making sense is in places where it's very expensive to deliver, because there's such a large amount of time of driving without making a delivery or without picking someone up. There the opportunities to have electric vehicles and autonomous vehicles that could lower the cost per mile could actually be quite useful, even if you can maintain utilization through a contract with a particular company, for example. And the final example I'll mention, which is not something that Nuro is doing, but we did acquire Ike, which is a trucking company, and which other companies are doing is heavy duty trucking, which again not a current area for Nuro, but that, especially if you're in an agricultural area, the ability to extend the reach of autonomous vehicles, of trucking in a 2-day period, because autonomous vehicles don't necessarily need, they're not subject to the same hours of service rules, because there's no driver that could get tired. That could actually extend the markets for a lot of rural areas. So that could be a very attractive thing for certain types of rural areas.
So I think the pandemic probably accelerated the expansion of delivery services, and probably propelled Nuro a little bit. But one of the questions we have is, why focus on delivery first? Why is that important?
The reason is because it allows us to get the benefits of robotics into people's lives much faster. Nuro is less than 5 years old, but we have been the first ones to receive an exemption from the federal government, the first to receive a deployment permit from California, the first operated vehicle in 3 states that's fully autonomous, and with no driver in it. And the reason for that is partly our focus on delivery. When you remove the person from the vehicle, it allows you to make the vehicle safer. It allows you and it also allows you to prioritize. When you're developing a self-driving passenger vehicle, you need to think about 3 things. How do you keep other road users safe? How do you keep your occupants safe? And how do you keep your occupants comfortable, right? Because if you're jamming on the brakes all the time, no one's going to use your robotaxi again. And so with goods, obviously we want to keep other road users comfortable, right? We don't want to just slam on the brakes if there's a tailgate or anything like that. But there's a lot of things you can do if you just don't have to make trade-offs between those 3 things, right? We're only focused on other road user safety, and that allows us to design our software in a way that is safer and therefore is safe to deploy sooner. So that's kind of the business case. The other part of this is that there's just a huge potential impact on people's lives. We all wish we could get time back. We spend 140 hours a year as an average adult driving to and from the store. I would like much of that time back to do things that are important to me. And so that's it's actually a really big part of why we use our vehicles is getting goods. It's almost half of all trips. So those are a few reasons to focus on delivery first, but interested if Mark, if you have additional thoughts there too.
Yeah, I mean, just real quick, I think for the reasons you laid out, Matthew, that there's a strong case to start with goods movement, and I think you've seen this interest. I mean, we move so much freight by highway. I mean, every year more than $10 trillion of freight moves by road in the United States. And that is just a very powerful motivator, especially as you say, we have all sorts of additional considerations you have to make when you're dealing with human passengers. Freight is just not quite as complex in certain ways, both regulatory and otherwise.
Thank you. We have another viewer question in. How can states better partner with the federal government here? And, this whole discussion has evolved around, unintentional consequences that state and local governments can create. But we all want to do something to further this type of service. So what can states better do?
Well, I think, there's been some promising developments on this. One I'd like to point out is the AV test initiative that the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration deployed last year, and you can look this up online, but it's I think at the very early stages, but it's cataloging, it's partnering with state departments of transportation, including FDOT, Florida Department of Transportation, to collect information on test activities, state policies. That kind of a clearinghouse, I think is potentially very valuable going forward. And then to build on that, to actually have sort of in-person, what we do in-person things again, or virtual collaborative discussions, which have been ongoing. So I think it's really just to build on those going forward. And
just briefly, I think that both states and the federal government have unique expertise here. States in particular from their work in law enforcement, vehicle inspection, right? They're seeing what's happening on the roadways today, and they can see where this technology can be most valuable. They're seeing how new technologies like autonomy intersect with electric vehicles, and create new opportunities as well as challenges. So I think that there's a lot of benefit in collaborating and bringing that state expertise to the federal government, so they can prioritize their work and incorporate that as they work on vehicle safety standards.
Thank you. How does Florida's regulatory landscape compare to other states?
I'll take a stab at that. So I think Florida's really been a leader in this. There's been a bill, I think, in each of the last 3 or 4 sessions to keep updating it for the framework for update for developments in AV technology, and the framework, I think, is as a result, it's pretty sophisticated and robust. It's one of the only that deals with the case of remote operators. And this year, as I alluded to earlier, Florida is one of the first to consider the state vehicle codes issues, where states have requirements for windshield wipers or mirrors on vehicles that may not have a human in them. And so I think that Florida is really a leader in that. It also does set some minimum standards for safety without creating a regime that takes sort of years to launch in. So I think that's important, right? For example, the ability to pull over safely if something goes wrong, to have adequate insurance and so forth. So I think there's some really important provisions that Florida has included, and so I think it's really a leader and could be a model for other states.
Yeah, I completely agree. And I think, Senator Brandis has really emphasized the role of insurers in discovering what the proper coverage should be for these types of things. But I think really importantly, having them have a seat at the table early on was a great idea. It's been in some states that's been an afterthought, if a thought at all. And I think, but having the vehicle insurers there, who they're going to have to develop the policies for this over time, and it makes a whole lot of sense to have them there.
One follow-up comment on the insurance front. I think that it may make sense in the coming years, to revisit the insurance provisions. I think in the early stages when there's companies that are testing the technology may make sense different than when it's kind of widely deployed. All right, at some point we should have a regime that mirrors what we have for conventional vehicles. But I understand the kind of the early emphasis on insurance at this stage of the industry.
And I think you're starting to see that take shape. I mean, in Arizona, which has seen the most recent legislation pass, where they're going with, say, transportation network companies that may be automated using ADS-equipped vehicles in the future. They're saying, keep those requirements the same, those insurance requirements, regardless of if there's a human driver or a vehicle. So I think that seems to be the direction things are moving in, but that's a point well taken, Matthew.
Excellent. Mark and Matthew, we have more viewer questions coming in. The next one is it helpful to classify autonomous last mile delivery robots as personal delivery services?
So let me jump on this one.
I'm sorry,
so that
personal delivery
devices is a term for sidewalk robots. So it's not helpful because our vehicles don't go on the sidewalk. And I think this is a really common confusion. And I think because they're both robots that are transporting goods like hot food. And so I do think that this is something that there needs to be a lot more clarity about. A vehicle that goes 3 miles an hour on the sidewalk, I can understand not requiring a lot of safety equipment on that vehicle. But if the vehicle is starting to go on, a 25, 35, or 45 mile an hour road, that may present some different issues. And so there's a very elaborate regime for motor vehicle regulation that we've talked about at the federal level that applies to vehicles like Nuros. And states are, I think, now engaging in how should we regulate personal delivery robots that are designed to primarily go on the sidewalk. One challenge they face with that is that there's a lot of places with no sidewalks. So in Houston, for example, there's I think about 6,000 miles of roadway, about 3,000 miles of that have sidewalks, and about maybe 10% have bike lanes, 300 miles. And so, if you are building a vehicle for the sidewalk and there's no sidewalk, what do you do and how do you make sure it's safe on the roadway is, I think, is something that the states need to engage in, but it's a different question than how is basically a vehicle modeled after a car operating safely on a roadway.
I think we have time for one more question, gentlemen. Let's see, and we have a lot of questions streaming in, so hopefully we'll have another opportunity to have this discussion in the fall. You both have mentioned concerns about state and federal legislation being prohibitive to these new technologies. If they don't catch up with the technology, are you concerned about cities even beginning to preempt and try to legislate for themselves?
I can take this first, Matthew. I am very concerned about cities trying to get too far into matters that they really don't have any expertise. I mean, your state DMV may not be able to replicate the functions of the National Highway Traffic Safety Administration really well, but your municipal public works or county public works department is even less equipped. So I am concerned, and I would really, and I have cautioned city officials, county officials from doing this because moving too quickly, because it has already caused state legislators to preempt cities from regulating any aspect of vehicle automation. And I think there are proper roles for urban governance in this equation, especially when you're talking about things like managing the curb. But trying to do too much at the local level is just a recipe to get the state to preempt you. So that's sort of where
I think our approach is we want to have a conversation with the city about what their objectives are, what their concerns are, and engage them directly so that any concerns that they may have, we can either through education explain how we've already addressed that, or potentially modify our operations to take that into account. And also, how can we use our services to advance their goals, like that partnership I mentioned about serving residents of the paratransit community. So I think there's a lot we can do just through engagement and discussion that can help mitigate those concerns, because there is a pretty robust federal, there is a federal process and a state process that is going on as well.
Well, Matthew and Mark, I really appreciate your insights today. This has been a fantastic discussion and very timely. I hope that you will all be able to join us in person at the 2021 Florida Automated Vehicle Summit here in Orlando at Rose and Shingle Creek from November 28th to December 2nd. For updates on registration, speakers, and demonstrations,
Thank you, Laura.
visit FAV.